Du tittar på ett frukostseminarium från ekosystembaserad havsförvaltning. En seminarieserie om hållbar utveckling av vår havsmiljö. Vad säger den samlade forskningen om status för strömming och skarpsill i Östersjön? Om det berättar Lina Birgersson och Cathrine Pedersen Schirmer som skrivit rapporten Small Fish with a Big Impact. Rapporten är skriven för Fiskesekretariatet och redogör för vad vi vet och hur vi kan skapa en bättre förvaltning av dessa nyckelarter.
My name is Lina Birgersson, and I am a co-author of this report from Fiskesekretariatet. I hope you can hear me properly. So we are happy to be here to present this report and the project that Fiskesekretariatet has had about fish. And I will start presenting it and hand over to Cathrine partway through. So this project is called Small Fish, Big Impact, and it started in late 2023 and is finishing up this spring with funding from the Swedish Lottery Foundation and SWAM, or HAV. And the goal or aim of the project is to give an overview of the current scientific knowledge on Baltic Sea forage fish and also give recommendations for their management. So the main output of the project has been our report and the recommendations that are based on the findings in the report. And that means that the project activities have also been tied to this report, the research, the writing, and the distribution stages. And we also perform different analysis of the fisheries management here, as we call it, when ICES comes out with their advice, for example, in the spring, and also the setting up the quotas in October for the Baltic Sea stocks, which is, of course, very relevant for sprat and herring. So the report, it's a spin-off really to a previous report we did on Baltic Sea cod. And similarly to that report, we started out with a literature review. So it's meant to give an overview of recent scientific knowledge published from during the last 10 years, roughly. And we used the same method as one would use for a review paper, basically, with predefined search criteria and using the Scopus database mainly for searches. And then the papers that we got from that search went through a selection process with the predefined criteria to sort them by relevance. And then we also added other literature as the time went on in the project as well, including also reports which do not show up in this initial search but are still very relevant. And things that were excluded and not relevant would be things that are published in other languages that we couldn't read, of course, and also outside of the geographic scope of this study, which was focused on the Baltic Sea. So you can find the report using this QR code or the link, and it's also linked on the webinar description for today. But it's important to keep in mind that this is not new data, but a summary of existing knowledge. So that means if you're a bit familiar with the Baltic Sea and the fisheries there, you're going to have heard a lot of this before. Doing this literature review, we got a range of different papers, which could be sorted into different topics. So we try to do that just to split the report into chapters. A lot of them are looking at forage fish and their interactions with other species, their role as prey, for example, interactions with different predators, how the ecosystem in the Baltic Sea has changed, competition between sprat and herring, and also competition and interaction with the stickleback. This is a topic that has been increasing over time as the stickleback have increased. And then there are some studies looking at condition, growth, reproduction, often linked also to other factors like external stresses like climate change, eutrophication and pollution, which are problems not just for forage fish in the Baltic Sea, but in general. And then, of course, fisheries management and consumption are also studied. So for the Baltic Sea, there are two main forage fish species, sprat and herring being strömming or sill in Swedish, depending on where it's caught. And these are the most common pelagic fish. They take up a big part of the biomass, and they also have very high economic importance, being the top landed in terms of both weight and value for the area. And that means that they're also an interesting topic to focus on for scientific studies, both for their ecological and economic and cultural importance. So the sprat started to increase a lot after the decline of the eastern cod around the 90s, and is mainly used for industrial processing. whereas herring is also a popular fish to eat. It's tied to, we had a look at all the countries around the Baltic Sea, and it is culturally important in all of them and popular to eat. Sometimes more everyday scenarios, but for Sweden, for example, we have the strömming and the pickled herring that are more tied to specific times of the year. So herring is managed in 4 different units in the Baltic Sea. We have the Gulf of Bothnia herring in the north, the Riga herring in the small Gulf of Riga area, the Central Baltic herring, which takes up a pretty big part of the sea, and the Western Baltic spring spawning herring in the southwest. But there are more genetically distinct populations than 4. So these are graphs from ICES showing spawning stock biomass for the 4 herring stocks in the Baltic Sea. And you don't need to look at this in detail. I just wanted to show the general downwards trend for 3 of them, whereas the Gulf of Riga herring in the lower left corner has been doing quite well, has been increasing actually. And one important reference point to look at when you look at these graphs is B-lim, which is this line that I marked with the orange arrow. And as you can see for the Western Baltic spring spawning herring, it's doing very poorly. It's been below this critical level for many years and still is below. The Central Baltic herring has been also fluctuating on this line for quite some time. And if a spawner stock biomass falls below this reference point, there's a risk for collapse because the stock might not be able to reproduce enough to build back up. So it's important to stay above this level. The sprat shown here as the spawning stock biomass on the left and recruitment on the right in the light blue has been quite stable until recent years, where it declined a bit because the recruitment was very low for 3 consecutive years, as you can see encircled in orange. And these values are among the lowest in the time series, and it's also quite unusual to have such low values for several years in a row, even though recruitment, as you can see, varies quite a bit for sprat normally. So these fish are very important. As I mentioned, they have an economic importance, but more importantly, they also have a role to play in the ecosystem and the food web. They bring energy and nutrients from the lower trophic levels, from plankton, upwards to the bigger predators, and act as a link or a sort of engine for the whole ecosystem. Sorry. Okay. So in the Baltic Sea, the food web is a bit simpler than, for example, the North Sea, where there are more species. But based on our literature overview, we see quite a few species anyway that people are looking at as interacting with forage fish in the Baltic Sea. Cod being probably the top one, but also a commercially important, or used to be at least, commercially important species, and it's been dominant in the Baltic Sea together with sprat and herring. Then we have the salmon, which also eats sprat and herring. Northern pike studies are a lot less common, but there are some looking at the state of pike, or the status of pike being affected by a lack of herring along the coast in the south. Different marine mammals and seabirds as well, like by Carl Söner. There are several studies, for example. And then we have the stickleback, which does not feed on adult sprat or herring because it's so small, but it can be an issue for competition and also for egg predation. I will just dip into a few of these a little bit now. And the cod, as mentioned, we had a previous project where we did a report on the Baltic cod and its decline. So you can read more there. It's also linked on our webpage. But there are 2 stocks of Baltic cod, and they're now both in very poor shape or collapsed, essentially. And one reason behind this is suggested to be the lack of food, which affects their growth and condition. So the interaction between these 3 is among the most studied when it comes to fish in the Baltic Sea. For salmon, many of the studies are not just looking at food availability, but also food quality. So the salmon have had issues with reproduction, which can, for example, be linked to the thiamine that they consume. So thiamine is vitamin B1, and if they don't get enough thiamine, their fry might not be able to hatch and survive. So that's of course a big problem. And some studies have seen that if the salmon feed too much on very young sprat, they will have less thiamine and more of issues with their fry. So it's important that they can get herring as well to eat. And the interaction with stickleback, as mentioned, it's more and more published because the stickleback have increased so much. This is partially because of predation decline. Both the pike and perch along the coast have been declining, and stickleback are quite opportunistic and able to handle eutrophication and increasing temperatures, etc. And they also create a feedback loop where they feed on the eggs of their own predators and thereby are able to expand even more. And as mentioned, there's some diet overlap with the smaller sprat and herring, causing competition. And also, stickleback is one of the main culprits when it comes to egg predation for herring, together with the perch. And also linked to stickleback is some studies that are more recent-ish, but the fish are not new, of course. The large piscivorous herring that are able to eat stickleback and other small fish. These are genetically unique and unusually large and can be found. There's at least 2 different groups of these in the Baltic Sea along the Swedish coast, one in the Gävle Bay and one that's from around Stockholm and south towards Kalmar. And these grow very fast and get unusually large. So it's suggested that they can be an important predator and a way to balance the stickleback population, because the stomach content in these big herrings consisted of a lot of sticklebacks. And when it comes to herring, it's also important then to preserve the genetic diversity that they have, particularly for the Central Baltic herring and the Rapporten herring stocks. This is mentioned. And this is my final slide, where I will just give an overview of external factors or stressors that affect the forage fish in the Baltic Sea. And this is its own chapter in the report. Keep in mind that this is a simplification. It's not going to affect the fish identically all across the entire Baltic Sea, and also not going to affect sprat and herring exactly identically either. But on top of that, these factors interact with each other. But it's just to give an idea that the situation is quite complex and it's a tough environment for fish to live in. Fishing pressure, of course, has an effect. If you take up fish, there's going to be less left, and that's also affecting age structure. Food availability is also affected by the competition, both between sprat and herring and also with the stickleback, as I mentioned just before. Climate change is another big factor that will continue to be an issue, not just for forage fish. And that can have both direct and indirect effects. So, for example, food availability can be affected by climate change because zooplankton are often quite sensitive to changes in temperature or salinity, for example. Some studies, particularly for the Western Baltic herring, have looked at how climate change can affect also the matching of herring fry and their food. So if there are warming winters and seasonal shifts that make the herring hatch earlier, there might not be food availability of the right size at the right time. So because of this shift, which can be a problem, and then they might starve even though the zooplankton are there, but they're not small enough for them to eat at the right time. And then eutrophication, of course, and pollution are key problems that Helcom also points out for the entire Baltic Sea. And access to suitable habitats for spawning is also a problem. So in order to hear more about solutions for this, I will hand over to Cathrine for our recommendations.
Thank you, Lina. So my name is Cathrine Pedersen Schirmer. I'm a colleague of Lina and I'm a policy advisor. And I will get you through some of the policy recommendations. I've picked a few. We have many more in the report, but I highlighted a few to present to you here. Next slide, please, Lina. So, right. So I will just give you a brief overview of how fishing quotas and fisheries management is decided in the Baltic. Some of you may very well know and others not, so I'm just going to give you a quick wrap up. But basically in the Baltic we have 10 TACs, we call it, so total allowable catches. So these are 10 stocks that are fished commercially where there are fishing limits set at EU level. There might be also nationally, of course, some fishing restrictions on other stocks, but at EU level, these are the 10. So we have two cod stocks, we've got 3 herrings, 2 plaice, and 2 salmon. And the system is that the Commission asked the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea to come up with advice of how much can be fished in order to have the maximum yield of that given fish stock without the stock collapsing. So this is what we're talking about, the maximum fishing yield also. And so ICES produces this advice on a yearly basis, and that's what we call the fishing year. We've also described it a little bit more in our report, but basically in the spring, ICES comes out with its advice, and then the Commission analyzes it and makes a first proposal, and then the European Council decides and finally sets the fishing quotas for the next year. So it's a yearly system. And at the moment, the way it works is very much that the scientists and the decision makers look at each single species. So if you could press the button, Lina. I have used this graph here to show that at the moment we look at one species. So, for example, we have one cod stock, and ICES comes up with advice on how much can be taken out for that particular cod stocks without the stock collapsing. Now, the cod stock is closed for the moment and has been for many years now. So both the eastern and the western cod have been closed for fishing, as well as the western herring, because these stocks are in such poor conditions. But basically in its advice, as I said, ICES is looking how much can we maximize, how much can we take out without the stock going down in production. And this is a very old-fashioned way of managing, one can say, because of course, as Lina highlighted, we need to look at the whole ecosystem. What are the interactions between different stocks? How does climate change affect it? How is the habitat and the degradation of the habitat affecting the stocks and the predator? So we need to move away from just looking at each single stock and setting fishing limits for that stocks. We need to move on to at least an ecosystem-based fisheries management. So Lina, if you could press the next button. So we need to get at least to this, where we look at several species, how they interact, the climatic conditions, the climatic changes, the habitat, and the predation. But of course, ideally, we need to go into ecosystem-based management, the next step where we look at all the pressures that and all the uses that are in the Baltic Sea. And I think next week or next time you have this this breakfast forum, you have Sarah, who is an expert in EBM, and she will be able to explain in much more detail how you get about this. Next slide. I wanted to show you what this advice looks like when it comes from ICES. So it's a lot of text, sorry for this, but basically this is the advice for herring, the fishing advice for this year. And basically you have at the very top how much ICES advises one can fish. And then it provides also other information, like, for example, that there might be some regional conservation management measures, but they have not been taken into account. And then it provides an overview of the stock. So shows the recruitment, how many young fish have come into the stock, the catches, and the fishing pressure, and the biomass. So that's really how the advice is presented. And then all the details comes below, and they're really long, these advices. But basically, decision makers usually just look at the first bit, which is called the headline advices. So the figure, how much ICES says one can maximum fish. And that's very problematic, because we are not looking at the wider context of what are the other pressures that are affecting the fish stocks, what are the dynamics between species, and how much even should we leave in the sea for other predators like the harbor purpose and seabirds, etc. So what we need to do is to move away from this very narrow approach to fisheries management. Next slide, please. And the good thing is that at least ICES and the Commission have realized that the way we have managed the fisheries in the Baltic has not worked. Press again, next slide. So last year there was a meeting between ICES and DG Mare, so the Commission, where they have realized that the traditional management way of managing single species is not sufficient to address the complexities of the Baltic Sea because there are so many pressures, and we need an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management in order to recover these stocks that we have that are in decline and that are not recovering. So that's the very first good step. Next slide, please. Then in October last year, when the fishing limits were set for this year's, how much can be fished this year, there has been a joint statement by the Commission and other member states to actually look at how we can change the advice in order for ICES to also provide rebuilding advice. So basically, as I mentioned, and Lina explained as well, there are several stocks that are in a very bad condition, and these stocks, even though they have not been fished, are not recovering. So we need absolutely rebuilding trajectories. So what can be done in order to rebuild the stocks, and when does a stock need to be in a trajectory for rebuilding? At what point do we need to do that? Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight also because that Sweden has been actually a front runner and has been very good at pushing here the importance of looking much more at the scientific advice. And this is a statement from Sweden at the Fisheries Council that they have also highlighted that one needs to look at also the size structure and the population structure, and to have other complex realities of marine ecosystem, and looking at the broader human activities, the effects of human activities, natural mortality from predators, and the broader ecosystem dynamics. So I just wanted to highlight that Sweden is actually very far in its position to push ahead at EU level to change the way that we manage the Baltic fish stocks. Next slide, please. So what we need to do at first is to really move away from the single species catch limits to a broader multi-species ecosystem advice. So ICES needs to provide a different type of advice that encompasses many more complex dynamics of the Baltic ecosystem. We need to also build towards a rebuilding plan. So for key stocks that are going to have a downward trend, we need to look at how can we rebuild them so that their biomasses are growing. And we need to have advice on healthy age and size structure, also something that's required under the MSFD and other EU legislation on a healthy marine ecosystem. Next slide. Then, when fishing limits are decided, it's absolutely crucial that decision makers set fishing limits, which is here FMSY, it's another word. So these fishing limits need to be set at a level that are much, much lower than we currently set the fishing limits. And that is in order to have an extra precautionary buffer, because there are so many things we don't know about the ecosystem. There are so many changes in the productivity of the fish stocks. And there are other effects, such as, for example, catch misreporting. That means that actually you might have a different set of data than what's actually been caught, because there has been some misreporting by fishermen on their catches. So in order to ensure that we are not overfishing and that we are not setting extra pressure on the ecosystem, we need to really set the fishing limits well below what ICES is advising until we have this EBFM advice and a rebuilding trajectory. We need to absolutely initiate these recovery plans. So what we are suggesting is at the moment when a fish stock goes below a certain threshold, and Lina was showing you earlier the orange line, that's already too late. That's when the stock is already in a risk zone. There is another threshold, which is called a B trigger, which basically shows that the stock is in a downward trend, and it means that we have to trigger action. That's why it's called B trigger. So once a stock is falling below this threshold, automatically management should move into a recovery trajectory, meaning that fishing limits are absolutely either stopped or kept below a minimum in order for the biomass to be able to grow healthy again. And we need to do this for a minimum of 3 years, because what we are also seeing historically is once a fish stock is rebounding, so once ICES says, okay, the biomass is now healthy again because we have in the past reduced the fishing pressure, usually what decision makers do is instantly increase the quota again, and then the fishing pressure is really high, and then often what we see is that in the following years, the stock is again going on a downward trend, is something that we want to avoid. So for at least 3 consecutive years, we must ensure that the biomass is at healthy levels. Next slide. Then absolutely crucial, we all know the Baltic Sea is in a very bad state. We know that a lot of habitats are degraded. Lina also talked about the lack of food, and all of this is of course because of the bad state of the Baltic Sea, and that affects fish stocks. But we also need to protect spawning and nursery habitats of fish stocks, and we actually don't yet know exactly where all the spawning grounds are and the nursery habitats of all the different fish stocks in the Baltic. So we also need to improve the data we have, and we need to improve the migration route, the data we have on migration route, and the importance of the different subpopulation in a stock. So for example, in a herring stock, we have different subpopulations, and they might have different migration route or even different age and size structures. So it's absolutely important that we protect and restore these spawning grounds and nursery habitats, and that we improve our data on that, and that we use spatial measures, and these could be seasonal closures, for example, when we know that fish are aggravating in order to spawn, that we close the fishery in that area. So that is also something that is already happening now for some stocks. However, we are not entirely certain that this is in the right time that the closure is, or in the right area. So a lot more data is required here, and better management in order to ensure that we actually close the fishery when the stocks are aggravating in order to spawn, so we don't fish the stock before they even spawned. Next slide. And then lastly, one of the key issues also is that we don't implement the rules. So we have actually very fine rules, the Common Fisheries Policy, which is a framework for fisheries management in the EU. It sets out a number of rules. We also have a control regulation, EU control regulation, that specifies how fisheries should be controlled and how fishers should report their catches, etc. And what we're seeing is that, unfortunately, in the Baltic Sea, we still have an issue with a misreporting of catches. So that's especially a problem in the pelagic fisheries, where we have seen that herring sometimes is reported as sprat catches, or vice versa, depending on whether the ship has the right quota. So if they're catching, for example, sprat, but they only fish herring, they might actually report the herring catches as sprat because they don't have the quota for the sprat. So that's a huge issue. ICES is aware of it, and is to some extent trying to include that into the advice. But of course, it's difficult when they don't have the full data of what is really taken out of the sea. So there are absolutely, it's important that control agencies are effectuating much more control out in the sea, but there are also ways of controlling the landings when they come to sea with independent assessors to check what is actually in the catch, and does that reflect the logbooks. So that's absolutely key. There are also issues in the Baltic around the landing obligation, which is basically an EU rule where you are supposed to land everything you catch. So you cannot catch something and then throw some of it overboard, but instead you have to land everything you catch, and that allows for to have a better idea of what is actually being caught. Yet that is not always happening. So we see that a lot in the flatfish. So, for example, in the plaice fishery, where there is a bycatch of cod, and because the fishermen don't have the quota, what happens sometimes is when they by mistake, they throw it overboard. But then, of course, when they don't report it, when they land, and then there is the issue that we actually don't know how many cod were caught, and the survivability is very low, so the fish is dead, basically. So these are issues, but they can be addressed. We have the right tools, but it's up to member states to really make a bigger effort to implement those rules. And I think that's it. Lina, can you change the slide just to be sure? Yeah, this is the full set of recommendations in the report. You can read them. And I think Lina has put a QR code at the start of the presentation where you can download the report. But please feel free to ask any questions. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to present today to you.
And thank you, Cathrine and Lina. I had this on my bedside table since I met you before Christmas, Lina, and I think it's really, really good report. And you summarize the situation very, very good, and with clear recommendations and so on. And if I just start, I mean, many of these things has been repeatedly argued by the NGOs and the environmental movement and a lot of others in a number of years. And in a very tragic way, we see that now that we have been right, we should have fished much more careful and so on. So before you started today, you said that you also presented this at the Baltic Sea Advisory Council. And what was the reaction there? Was there some kind of self-reflections? I mean, the Baltic Sea Advisory Council, for the ones that of you that don't know what it is, it's the majority of the representation there is from the commercial fisheries. So, what was the reaction when you presented your work there?
Well, I can start maybe, and Lina, you can join. I think that it's a mixed bag, one can say, because all fishermen are, of course, have not all the same position and have a different way of fishing as well. So I think some of them really welcomed the report and thought they were interesting. Some actually also said, okay, well, in terms of some of the control measures, maybe we can do these things differently. But so they were generally open, and at the same time, there is also some views represented in the fishing community, which says that, well, it's not the fishermen's fault, it's everything else. So it could be agriculture, for example, because of the eutrophication issues. So why should we do something when it's actually another sector that is creating most of the problem? And also often what is also pointed at is the seals are often blamed for the bad situation of some of the stocks and cormorants. So basically it's a little bit shifting the blame game happening, which is very unfortunate because, of course, we cannot say it's just one single factor, and that's also something that we highlighted in the report. There are many different pressures on these fish stocks in the Baltic Sea, and we need to address all of them. That we all agree. But of course, each sector has to take responsibility, and each sector has to change the way we manage, because otherwise we will not really build these stocks. So I would say generally there is a little bit of a lack of taking responsibility towards changing the situation. That's my sort of impression. Yeah, I don't know, Lina, if you have some other reflection.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yes, no, I agree with you. And it's quite difficult because sometimes it can be upsetting to say that it's easiest to do things about the fishery, because it is. Like we have the most control over fishing because that's set year to year. Whereas climate change, for instance, is going to take a very, very long time to improve, but it actually needs to change on multiple levels in order to improve the situation for these fish. So it's important to not ignore the other factors, but also be aware that lower fishing is going to, of course, help the most critical stocks.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not really the case that the other issues are not addressed. I mean, we are dealing not with with beautification and seals and cormorants as well, for that matter.
Of course.
So are there any questions from you in the audience? And please, if you can just raise your hand and please also introduce yourself and say your name and what is the organization that you represent. Or, of course, write questions in the chat and I can... Then I have another one. One thing that we have discussed as well with both the Swedish fisheries and the Finnish fisheries, and I know also that it was a thing that that the Swedish government has raised is this thing with flat rates that have this lower tax for fish mortalities, but also for several years. So both the stocks have the capacity to rebuild, but also so that for the fishing industry, it's easier to plan their fishing. Is there something that was discussed during the meetings or something when you present this as well?
Yes. So to have more stability, it's definitely, so I have several years with the same fishing quotas is definitely something that is being discussed. It is absolutely makes sense because, of course, fishing operators need stability and need to be able to plan ahead. That's key. As long as these fishing limits are, of course, set precautionarily, that makes total sense. What we all want to avoid are these kind of yo-yo quotas, right? So we are really high up, and but that's unfortunately still what we're seeing. So, for example, in last October at the Fisheries Agriculture meeting where the quotas were set for this year, we saw again that because of the modeling showed that the spread was increasing, the biomass, even though there was a lot of uncertainty about it, still the quotas were increased significantly. And that's unfortunately what happens. It's like the moment the stock increases, boom, the quotas are set very high. And if it's the other way around, the stock decreases, usually the response rate to cutting quotas is much slower, of course, right? And for the Eastern Baltic cod, for example, scientists and NGOs have called for closure of that fishery for many years before the Commission finally has pulled the full stop and said, now we have to close this fishery. So basically what unfortunately happens is that instead of seeing the alarm bells and saying to reduce the quota, fisheries managers wait too long and then there's a closure, and that now the cod is not recovering and unlikely to recover at all. So I think that's why these rebuilding trajectories are key. So if a fishery falls, if a fish biomass falls below a certain threshold where we say here we need to trigger action, we automatically go into a different management mode, more precautionary, building the fish stock for at least 3 years consecutively until it's healthy, and then we can increase the quota again. So that's really what we would like to see.
We had a question, some question now comes in here in the chat. So the first one is Sophie from the Länsstyrelsen Gävleborg, who asked, with this being a literature review, where would you say the data is lacking the most? Where or at what would be good to focus near future research?
I think there are, of course, several areas that could use more research, and there is research ongoing. But for instance, the zooplankton that they eat is interesting to keep monitoring and following the diet of the herring, for example, which has been fluctuating a bit, for example, in the Botnian Bay. So that's something that ICES themselves have suggested that should continue to be more monitored and studied. Similarly, this genetic diversity of the herring stocks is also something to keep researching. And then also I think something that's of course relevant for these fish is the use of them for industrial processing to fish meal and fish oil. And we found that it's kind of difficult to find data on that for all of the countries around the Baltic Sea. So that's something that could be its own report, I think. And I know RISE did a report that came out 2024, looking mainly at the processing in Denmark. And they were also pointing out that there's a bit of a lack of transparency for this. Cathrine, do you have any additions?
Yeah, and just in terms of management, what's also missing still is the full mapping of the spawning areas and the nursery areas, so that we can protect these areas. That's absolutely key as well. And we have some mapping also at Helcom. They have done quite good work at this, finding the relevant studies and putting it together into one research, but they're not often up to date. So that would be good to have more research on that.
We also got a comment from Johan Eklöf at Stockholm University, who's thank you for a very interesting presentation, but also ask you if you've seen the recent studies about diet overlap and interspecific competition for food between herring, spat, and sticklebacks, and these new findings say that that overlap is not so big actually, because especially sticklebacks seem to have a quite own niche, feeding them a lot more on the specific gelatinous zooplankton species or assembly. So yeah, what's your reaction to that comment?
If it's super new, then it's not going to have been included in the report just because they finished it earlier last year. Before the summer. So I know there are some new exciting things that can come out during that time or after as well. It would have been fun, of course, to include. But yes, I think with the stickleback, it's probably the egg predation then that's a bigger issue, really. And it's varied a bit, I think, what the studies were saying, if there was a competition for food or not. And that could also maybe vary a bit along the coast and where in the Baltic Sea you are. So that would be, of course, interesting to see that study.
Okay, yes, tell you from this studies that we did conduct this summer, we only did it in the Stockholm archipelago, but we measured with the hydroacoustic sonar devices the density of all pelagic fish, and then we found that in areas where there are a lot of herring, there are less sticklebacks, and vice versa. So, but I don't know if that's really correlation and affected by this. But I think this is very interesting topic in a way. We have another questions from Ivar Jansson that the Baltic countries seem to have managed their fishing of herring better than we are. What is difference with their handling of the problem? First of all, do you agree on that?
Cathrine, do you want to?
Yeah, so the quotas for the herring, that's set at EU level, right? So that's the same. So basically, it's decided at EU level where all the member states basically decide how much should be fished. There might then be national implement rules to protect certain areas, spawning areas, for example. I know in Sweden you also have this 12 nautical mile closure, I think, for pelagic fishing, and then there might be some in Finland as well, which I'm not so aware of. But I actually would not say that other countries are better than Sweden. I would say that Sweden is actually the country that's the best in managing herring, compared to the other countries, because you have this closure and the 12 nautical mile, and there is much more awareness of the need for rebuilding the stock. Like I showed you the screenshot from the statement from Sweden. I think that Sweden is actually a really progressive country here with regards to herring management. But I don't
perhaps
have...
It's the Riga Bay herring that Eva is addressing.
Yeah, okay. That one, Lina, you have some more explanation why that stock is doing better?
I mean, that one is shared just between two countries, Estonia and Latvia. And I think, so I know there are more detailed studies on that, what they're actually doing and whether that could be used as a good example for the rest of the Baltic Sea. But it's also a bit specific because the Riga Bay is, or Gulf of Riga rather, is so small, and it's a genetically distinct, quite small stock that's actually been benefited by increasing temperatures to some extent because it's further north. But then also they have some limitations on fishing, I think seasonal closures, and also some, they have no demersal trawling, and then some limits on larger trawlers as well. So I think they were suggesting several reasons why they could be going better there. And then also another interesting thing I think is that these are two of the countries that have the biggest direct consumption of these fish. So people eat them more regularly than we do in many of the other countries around the Baltic Sea. So they go straight to human consumption as well, these fish.
Du har tittat på ett frukostseminarium från ekosystembaserad havsförvaltning. Vi ses varje tisdag klockan 8:30 till 9:15. Hoppas att du lyssnar.